Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the time that we have to study here this morning or evening, depending on where we are. And we just ask, Lord, for your Spirit's presence to be here as we open up your word together. We know, Lord, there's much that we do not understand, and we need your help and your direction and guidance as we look at Daniel 11, verse 5 to 15, and try to understand this history that has been unfolding ever since late in 2016. And we know, Lord, that there's more than any one mind can comprehend, let alone present or understand fully. So we just ask that you can be our mind for us, that you can help us pull these things together. We pray for all those who participate or who watch these videos later. We ask, Lord, that your Spirit can bless them, that you can be with them. In Jesus' name we pray. Actually, before I go through those notes, I just wanted to look at a map. This isn't the greatest map in the world. But we have here, this is obviously Egypt. This is the Nile River, which doesn't really go in a straight line. It kind of curves like this. And this is supposed to be the Delta. And we know over here, of course, we have Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. And down here is the Gulf of Suez, and over here is the Gulf of Aqaba. And this is the Babylon and Persia over here. And the king of the north and the king of the south are dealing with battles between Egypt and Syria, and Judea is caught in the middle. And one of the ideas that I think I had missed, though I shouldn't have missed it, I don't think, is when we look at this history. So we're going to be going through Daniel 11, verse 5 to 15, and it's the history basically of the 5 Syrian wars. You know, there's also a 6th Syrian war that you could include in there, which is much later history. But this is a battle between Ptolemy and Seleucus, these 2 empires, which are a division of Greece, which we studied last week. And so we end up with the king of the north, which is Syria, and the king of the south, which is Egypt. And of course, this is the Ptolemaic Empire, named after Ptolemy. And this is the Seleucid Empire, is going to be up here, named after Seleucus. Now, Israel being caught in the middle, over here is the Dead Sea, and Jerusalem's over here somewhere. The reason why these battles are going on has to do with God's people, though I think we often leave that part out, because this is the king of the north in relationship to Israel, and this is the king of the south in relationship to Israel. And as time goes on, these kingdoms move around. The territory that they occupy changes, and even, you know, nations in a sense change, because we know that the king of the north becomes the papacy, the king of the south becomes France later on in our history, if you want to call the last few hundred years our history. But the thing is, God's people are caught between this battle, and there's going to be a lot happening here that are going to affect God's people. Ultimately, that's what this is about. So when we try to apply this then into our history, we need to recognize that this battle about the king of the north and the king of the south is really relating to us. It's really relating to God's people at the end of the world. And we have dealt with the concept that Bronwyn presented clearly, is that history is not dependent upon, or God's people are not dependent upon what's happening, unfolding as history unfolds. That history is dependent upon what God's people are doing. And when I think about this history here for God's people, this is in a period of darkness. This is after they had rebuilt Jerusalem and after the temple had been rebuilt. And it would be basically about 100 years or so after Nehemiah that you have Alexander the Great arise. And then this is the history immediately after Alexander the Great. It goes on for a few hundred years, couple hundred years, these battles. And they're going to end up culminating with the history where Rome comes into play. So this is leading up to Rome. And in the time of the Maccabees, when this Roman League occurred. And we're also going to see, in this history and trying to understand this about being this period of time, maybe I could kind of illustrate it. So this is going to be used another way. So I'll just draw this up here. But you have over here, you're going to have the cross, the time of Christ. But over here, you have the beginning of the 70 weeks, right? So in 457 BC. And then you're going to have this history in here, which is really the intertestamental period. The New Testament ends in the 5th century BC with
the Old Testament.
The Old Testament, ends in the 5th century BC with the book of Malachi, written around this time in here. And we know then as well that after that time we have this period where God's people are becoming more and more isolated. And we have this Greek period, which obviously the book of Daniel has presented. The real issue that's happening here is this influence of the Greeks. And it's not something we have often dealt with, because you really don't see a lot, other than Alexander, coming to Jerusalem. You don't really see a lot of interaction in the Bible dealing with this, because the Bible's not dealing with this period. But there is an influence that's happening with Israel that has to do with Greek thought. And that influence continues through here. So there's these two ways of thinking. There's the Jewish way of thinking, of studying and understanding the world. And there's this Greek way of thinking that's beginning to compete with the old way of thinking within Israel. And so this becomes a period of darkness, and we have not really lined these up to other periods of darkness, or to periods of the progressive destruction of 4. And I believe it's in Zechariah, when you're dealing with the chariots, that this is covering this period here. This is a progressive destruction of 4. So there's lots here that that we could look at that's outside of the book of Daniel. Maybe we'll turn there first, because I really want people to get an understanding of what I think, anyway, is happening in this period that sort of has been lost sight of. So this is in the book of Zechariah. I'll share the screen here so you can all see this. I'll blow this up. It's pretty tiny. Now, the book of Zechariah, as we know, is written during the time of Darius. It's the book that's written in connection with the rebuilding of the temple, and it addresses the period of 70 years for the temple. And so we're going to start at verse 7. Upon the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shebat, In the 2nd year of Darius came the word of the Lord unto Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, the prophet, saying, I saw by night, and behold, a man riding upon a red horse, and he stood among the myrtle trees that were in the bottom. And behind him there were red horses, speckled and white. And then said I, O my Lord, what are these? And the angel that talked with me said unto me, I will show you what these be. And the man that stood among the myrtle trees answered and said, These are they whom the Lord hath sent to walk to and fro through the earth. And they answered the angel of the Lord that stood among the myrtle trees and said, We have walked to and fro through the earth, and behold, all the earth sitteth still, and is at rest. Then the angel of the Lord answered and said, O Lord of hosts, how long wilt thou not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, against which thou hast had indignation these 70 years? So this is talking about the 70 years for the temple, not the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. But I find it interesting here, this question of how long, which shows up in Scripture in times of persecution. It shows up at the end of the 1260 years. It's the same question that's asked in Daniel chapter 8, dealing with the time during the time when they're under paganism, under pagan persecution. And we also see it here, but this is, of course, a different power, that this is not Babylon, this is Persia at this time. And of course, Persia has allowed them to get out of the Babylonian captivity. But there still is this question of how long. And this is addressing the 70 years for the rebuilding of the temple. So the temple is going to be rebuilt about 4 years after this. Now, so keep that in mind as we go through that. Now, we saw these horses. He saw a man riding a red horse. So let's just go back to verse 8. And behind him were red horses, speckled and white. So this man is riding a red horse, and there's other horses behind him, which are also red, some speckled horses, and some white horses. And we're going to see how this applies as we go on. So there's a bunch I'm just going to skip. And I think I'm looking in the wrong spot here, because I know the horses first show up there. So we have the horns, I think. Looking in the wrong spot with the high priest, the lampstand. Feel kind of a bit unprepared for this one. I didn't really think about it. It's chapter 6. That's where it shows up. So they first introduced this here in chapter 1, and then it's in chapter 6. So this is the vision of the 4 chariots. So we have these horses, and it's important to note that these horses go to and fro. And this to and fro is a Hebrew idiom for searching. So this is a type of investigation that it was occurring. So we have this here also in chapter 6. And I turned and lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came 4 chariots out from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of brass. So brass, we know, is a symbol of Greece. So when we're looking at this history and we see these mountains, to me, these would be two kingdoms. And I would think that, one way of looking at this, and this is just, some of this is just conjecture on my part. I'm not like adamant on any of this. But I would see that this would be, mountains or kingdoms can be seen as either two opposing kingdoms, because there's two mountains, but these are mountains of brass. And to me, it would be logical just on a surface area to say that this could be referring to Syria and Egypt, the king of the north and the king of the south, this division of the Greek kingdom. But, I'm not adamant on that. But there's 4 chariots that come. And in the first were red horses. So we see these red horses again. The second chariot, black horses. And the third chariot, white horses. And the fourth chariot, grizzled and bay horses. So these are multicolored. Grizzled would be spotted. Bay is, the tan, but also their manes can be different colors than their coat. Anyway, there's different ways of looking at this. They have a different classification system than we use now. We often talk about palominos and different things like that. So there's different ways in which these horses could be described. Those are always hard to tell what they're talking about. But then I answered and said unto the angel that talked with me, what are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said unto me, these are the 4 spirits of the heavens, which go forth from standing before the Lord of all the earth. Now, this word spirits here, if you look at the Hebrew, I'll just bring up King James with numbers. And you see that this word spirits is just the word ruach, which is the word winds. So it says spirits, but it could easily say these are the 4 winds of the heavens, which go forth from standing before the Lord of all the earth. So, it's just the way that the King James translates that. Sometimes the word ruach is translated spirits. Sometimes it's translated wind. Sometimes it's translated breath. And just plain King James is. Okay. So these are these winds, and these winds, we know at different times these winds are held back, different times they're allowed to blow. In the book of Revelation, we can see that there's parallels here in the book of Revelation with these horses, and obviously referring to a different period of time, but using this illustration. And it says in verse 6, the black horses which are therein go forth into the north country, and the white go forth after them, and the grizzled go forth toward the south country. And the bay went forth and sought to go that they might walk to and fro through the earth. And he said, get you hence, walk to and fro through the earth. So they walked to and fro through the earth. Then he cried upon me and spake unto me, saying, behold, these that go toward the north country have quieted my spirit in the north country. So this is something that I've studied ever since I was a child. I was always interested in this Zechariah. And partly because of its connection with the horses in Revelation. Now, and the horses there come under the seals as the seals are opened. But here we see that there is this symbolism of mountains of brass. We see that these horses are winds or spirits, and they're sent to these different localities. And we can see that they're sent to the north and the south. So what that exactly means, I'm not sure, but we are dealing in the book of Daniel with the king of the north and the king of the south. And now the bay ones, they walk to and fro through the earth. Now, this is my interpretation of this passage. If you want to know it, whether you think it's of any value whatsoever, But when I look at these four chariots, I see that they symbolize Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But when you're addressing the horses themselves, they're actually addressing a different period of time that's contained within that larger period. And so when they're the four winds of the heaven that go forth from standing before the Lord of the earth, these are what I would parallel with the progressive destruction of four that we see happening in the period from the time of Christ up until our time, or at least or to 1798. So that progressive destruction of four that happens, and then in our time, which starts in 1798, we have then a reform line. So there's this progressive destruction of four. And this to me is what this is talking about. It's talking about this history. And this history then is going to be going from the Persian period through the Greek period, and then it's going to look at the Roman period. And there are, the way that I would interpret it is I would take these black horses as being Medo Persia or Persia, the white representing Greece, and the grizzled with these, which would be like, a pinto. It's something, there's another word for it. What's the other word for like a pinto deer? When they're speckled and they're all different colors. Okay, and yeah, like a piebald, there's different ways you can describe it. There's another word I can't think of that they describe colors of horses. But if you think about this reminds me of the clay. So it reminds me of this, a mixture of something. And this to me would refer to papal Rome, which is basically a type of religious syncretism, mixing of Christianity with paganism. There's other ways in which we can also understand Rome having to that. So the miry clay, or this syncretistic religion that we have, that is Catholicism, the papacy, and that's how I would look at this period. So anyway, the point is that initially this is addressing the history, starting with the Persian period in which they're in, but there's this connection that they're stuck in this battle between the north and the south, and that's going to be in the future from the time of Zechariah. Obviously, Zechariah is in the time of the rebuilding of the temple, but he's talking about a future time, and that's the way that I would understand this prophecy. But I could be wrong. Maybe there's something more to it. But I introduced that to you because I think it's important in understanding, what this history is between the king of the north and the king of the south, in that this is a history that has been prophesied in the Bible, but isn't addressed in, after the fact. The Bible isn't writing about this history as it is about other histories. It only gives you this history in prophecy. Now I studied the intertestamental period in university, and it was pretty interesting from the point of that most Christians really don't understand what happened from Malachi to the book of Matthew. There is just not this understanding of what occurred. Now, of course, the book of Daniel is giving us that history in prophetic form. But I think to get to the point where you're starting in the time of Christ, there is this period of darkness. The people that lived in darkness saw great light, and that's Christ coming into the world. But they had to get to that period of darkness. And to get to that period of darkness, to have a reform line, we saw that the Jews became exclusive. They were cutting themselves off from other thought that was around them. They were trying to protect themselves from the mistakes of their forefathers, but they went to another extreme. They now were not a light to lighten the Gentiles. They themselves became in darkness. And this is where this history is addressing. So when we start to look at this history, the history of the divided Greek Empire and how it unfolds, I think that there are some things that we can start to see, especially as we relate it to present truth. But even when we look back in the past, I think that we can start to see why this is here, what the significance of these battles are, because that's the thing I'm trying to figure out. Why are these battles occurring? And, God's people are caught between, a rock and a hard place. Appaloosa, yeah, Appaloosa is one of the things. It's just Dana asked that question. Heidi had mentioned Appaloosa. I think I was thinking of paints. What's that? Yeah, paints. But yeah, Pintos, paints. That's the thing I was thinking of. So you got two colors. Piebald is another term. So, not my favorite horses, by the way. But thanks for that, Dana, and Heidi as well. So, we're going to go to our notes now and start reading through some of this. Now, I tried to do a lot of background reading, and I found it a little bit overwhelming. There's actually a book I have called The House of Ptolemy, which I downloaded and edited so I could get it into a format that was not so many pages. And I probably could, share that with people if people want to read it, but it's a lot of reading, and the author goes into lots of detail. Okay, again, I did that wrong. There we go. And I'm not great with people's names. So, and a lot of these names are unpronounceable to me. I mean, I looked them up on Wikipedia and tried to pronounce different names. It's just the Greek names, I find Greek hard to pronounce. Not sure why, but I just do. And I find them hard to remember. So if everybody had a number, it'd be a lot easier for me to remember and sort them out. But when we're looking at this history, obviously we're stuck with these names. And the other thing is, I've really been trying to have a story in my mind, something in which I can attach this history to. And in order to do this, I think, the best way is to sort of draw it on a line chronologically. I mean, that's the system that's been given to us, the method of drawing things on a line. It helps us to understand them. But anyway, we'll start reading these notes here from Tidings out of the Northeast. It says, as we examine the passage of Daniel 11, verse 5 to 15, we will discover an outline of how two Hellenistic monarchies, Syria and Egypt, had fought no less than 5 wars in a heated border dispute over the region of Judea-Palestine, also called Kol Syria. And that just refers to hollow Syria, due to the fact that it's in a hollow, the Jordan Valley, until their eventual overthrow by pagan Rome. In essence, God has taken the time to discuss these wars because of the fact that his people Israel dwelt in the area of contention. Furthermore, in this set of passages, Hellenistic Syria is called the king of the north, as this power would be located north of Israel. In a similar fashion, Hellenistic Egypt is called the king of the south, as this power would be located south of Israel. Also, it is important to note that as this prophecy outlines the history of the relationship between Hellenistic Egypt and Hellenistic Syria, it will traverse over the history of several kings from both powers and their interaction with one another and with Israel, and yet still refer to each power as the king of the north and the king of the south. We will offer a general survey of the conflict between Hellenistic Egypt and Hellenistic Syria, and discover that this section will cover each of the 5 Syrian wars fought between these two powers over the region of Kol Syria, Judea-Palestine, where the Jewish people resided. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion, and in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. So Daniel 11, verse 5 to 6. So we are somewhat familiar with this, hopefully. And Uriah Smith covers this history as well, very well. The king of the south shall be strong in one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. So using Judeo-Palestine as the point of directional reference, Hellenistic Egypt would be symbolized as the king of the south. Its first king, Ptolemy I Soter, and he reigned from 523 to 282 BC. So that's a period of about 1830, 41 years. He won distinction in the Persian campaign under Alexander the Great, so he was one of the generals, having served as one of Alexander's 7 bodyguards and his personal historian. Ptolemy was one of the ablest and wisest generals in the entire Greco-Macedonian army. He foresaw that Egypt could have great possibilities because of its isolated location from the potential hostilities that could arise between the other rival generals. Now, and I read this history in another place, so it's kind of interesting how he sums it up in a lot less detail. At his request, he was appointed satrap of Egypt by Perdiccas. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It should be Perdiccas. Alexander's former chief cavalry officer, and Philip III Arrhidaeus, one of Alexander's successors, who both oversaw the division of the empire after Alexander's death. Having established his reign without opposition, Ptolemy found that Egypt was easy to protect from invasion and possessed excellent natural defenses. He would easily consolidate his rule in this country of the Nile, becoming strong from the beginning of his appointment as a satrap. This particular dynasty would survive the longest out of all the Hellenistic monarchies. So obviously it lasted all the way to 30 BC, this dynasty, this continuation of the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, so there's a bit more complicated history involved here, but basically Ptolemy saw that he wanted Egypt. Perdiccas, who was sort of in charge of some of these things, he was acknowledged by Ptolemy. There was sort of this exchange. And then there's other things going on which, you know, the Bible isn't particularly referring to, but did help me sort of understand the story a little bit better of what was happening. Because we know that, you know, with Alexander's death, there's this sort of free-for-all where Alexander says it'll go to the strongest. So obviously, this whole power struggle that occurs is really complicated. And we know it finally ends up with these two powers, Syria, or the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemy in the south, Egypt, the Ptolemaic Empire. And just referring to this idea of these two Hellenistic monarchies, that's why I went back to the book of Zechariah, with these two mountains made out of brass, and also the references to the north and south that happen as well. So to me, that there has to be a reference to this history that's being talked about. Ptolemy had initially desired to greatly enhance Egyptian prestige by seizing the body of Alexander. So this is a whole interesting history as well. Perdiccas had actually planned to have Alexander's body laid to rest with the house of royal nobility in Macedonia. He had entrusted its transport to Philip III, who would take it from Babylon to Macedonia. Ptolemy, however, had other plans and would meet the young regent at Damascus, which is in Syria, where he would convince Philip to allow Alexander's body to be transported first to Memphis in Egypt, to await a permanent burial later at Alexandria. So I'm not sure the biblical significance of this, but this idea that Alexander has died and there's this sort of difference of where he should be buried, whether it should be in Macedonia, because he's a Macedonian, or whether it should be in Alexandria, which it eventually was. So the important reason why this is mentioned has to do with the rise of Ptolemy. Perdiccas was enraged at this event and responded by declaring war on Ptolemy. So the person that had it allowed Ptolemy to go to Egypt, is now at war with Ptolemy. As it turned out, Perdiccas was brutally murdered in a conspiracy after attempting 3 separate invasions of Egypt that proved unsuccessful. His own officers were among the conspirators, and the murderous entourage would be led by an ambitious former general of Alexander named Seleucus, who would later become the first Seleucid Syrian king, Seleucus I Nicator. And so there you see now we have these 2 powers, Ptolemy in Egypt and Seleucus in Syria. So that's why that history is important. And to me, that helps frame it a little bit, to understand a little bit behind the battle that occurred, the struggle that occurred to develop these 2 powers. During the original breakup of Alexander's empire in 323 BC, Seleucus was not given a territorial appointment, but would later become a satrap of Babylon. That's in 321 BC. Yet the growing power of Antigonus, the one-eyed, and his son Demetrius would force him to flee to Ptolemy for protection. And so you can see this like 5 years later, 316 BC. Placing himself under Ptolemy's command, Seleucus became one of Ptolemy's princes, receiving a commission as the commander of the Egyptian naval forces. They would later defeat Demetrius at Gaza, 312 BC, which would allow Seleucus to return to Babylon. He eventually joined the military coalition with Cassander, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy against Antigonus and Demetrius. And I think some of us are familiar with this. This was gone through this history back in 2018. We went through some of this, and even earlier. So we can see that there's these different generals. At times they change allegiances. When they have a common enemy, they fight together. But eventually we know that it's going to be Ptolemy and Seleucus who are going to be the 2 powers that control the Greek Empire. And they would make substantial contribution to the defeat and death of Antigonus in the Battle of Ipsus. So we've heard of that battle. And Seleucus and Lysimachus had actually gained the most territory after the Battle of Ipsus, which later led to a showdown between these 2 former generals in the Battle of Corupedium in 281 BC. After Lysimachus was defeated and killed, Seleucus emerged as the most powerful king, with the largest territory of all the former generals of Alexander. He would become more powerful than his former ally Ptolemy, strong above him, having great dominion, as the greatest king of all Alexander's successors. So it's the king of the north who becomes the most powerful. And this becomes important in the context of, as we look at all this history. The contention that Ptolemy I and Seleucus I would have over Coal Syria had its origin shortly after the death of Alexander. Ptolemy was originally awarded this region and would occupy it during the defeat of Demetrius at Gaza. Yet as Seleucus I would grow more powerful, this coveted region became a strong source of contention because of its location and natural resources. Following Antigonus's defeat at Ipsus by the 4 generals, Ptolemy I occupied Coal Syria once again, but Seleucus objected, contending that during the Battle of Ipsus, his Egyptian colleague had withdrawn his army after hearing a false rumor that Lysimachus had been defeated. As a result, Ptolemy had provided no military support for the operation. Now, I just want to make a point as I read through this and I think about Syria today. So, it's kind of amazing that this territory has been so much a territory of dispute throughout history, including Israel. And we can see that this is also true when you go through the period during the time of Islam. And especially when you deal with the end of the Second Woe, these battles between Egypt and Syria that are occurring, where these powers have to step in, the 4 European powers have to step in dealing with these battles over Syria. and of course, the power that's fighting against Egypt there is the Ottoman Empire, is Turkey. So Syria always becomes this focal point. Palestine, Coal Syria, becomes this focal point of all these different battles between kings of the north and kings of the south, between these different powers, and it still exists today in that contest. So it's kind of an amazing thing that you can read this book that was written, shortly after the fall of Babylon, and it's talking about something that is still present today. For somebody to just kind of dismiss the book of Daniel as something produced in the 1st century or 2nd century BC, depending on how you look at it, not being Daniel not really being a contemporary writer, just somebody taking on the name of Daniel. I would find that really, really difficult to sort of interpret it this way. There's just too much about the book of Daniel in the context of the present time to just sort of dismiss this. He could have written about lots of things, and if somebody had written a book after the Maccabean rebellion to encourage the Jews, the book of Daniel would not be one of them. There's so much in that book that would discourage the Jews at that time. The book looks way into the future. It doesn't look promising for God's people until sometime way in the future, and that there's a lot of things that are going to go wrong. And so I remember when I wrote a paper on a book report, basically, that a guy wrote about the book of Daniel, trying to say that it was, written in the 2nd century BC. It just didn't fit. It just did not fit. And so when I look at this here, this history of Syria, we can see that this is present truth. It's not something that's just in the past. When the battle was over, Ptolemy I once again claimed rights over the region, but the other 3 generals had felt that his withdrawal from the war effort made him unworthy of any territorial gain and decided in favor of giving Coal Syria to Seleucus. Remaining firm, Ptolemy I refused to surrender the region to his Syrian colleague, and because he realized that he owned his own power, his own rise to power, in part to Ptolemy I, for his past protection from Antigonus and Demetrius, Seleucus I was obliged to stand down in the dispute. Yet this contention over Coal Syria would eventually resurface and result in the 5 Syrian wars. So all these battles being fought over Syria. So that's just dealing with that those verses there. Now we're going to look at this part. In the end of years, they shall join themselves together. So this passage, and maybe I should draw this on a line before we move ahead here. I do want to go slowly. We're not trying to rush through this in any sense. Now, we have here Ptolemy the First, and of course we're going to have Seleucus the First. And these are going to rise at the death of Alexander. And I guess it's in 321, 322. I can't remember. I should remember these dates, but I don't. And it would have been in, let me see if I can get this here. And we know that there's these other players. We have Cassander, Lysimachus, we have Antigonus, Demetrius, these different people fighting over the Greek Empire. But these are going to lead to these Syrian wars. So you're going to have the first Syrian war. And that first Syrian war is going to be from 274 to 271 BC. So you can see this is quite a bit later that you start to have these battles. So there's this whole history in here that's leading up to these wars. And then you're going to have these other wars, the Second Syrian War. And that's going to be 260 to 253. And we're gonna look at these in more detail as we go along. And then we have the Third Syrian War. And the Third Syrian War is 246 to 241. And then we're going to have the Fourth Syrian War, which is the one that we really focus on, because this is where the Battle of Raphia happens in 217. And then you're finally going to have the fifth. And it shouldn't really say final, because there is a Sixth Syrian War, but that's much later. And this one's 202 to 195. So you have all these Syrian wars. I guess I could just write them here, the Syrian wars. You know, the sixth one is in, you know, if you want to have that here, is in 168. Now, and before that too, 170 to 168, I guess. But this is the one that we don't actually address. We don't believe that the Bible's addressing this. This is dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes. And we believe that there's a change that happens here, that this isn't really dealt with in that context. This is the rise then of the papacy. And this is where we would depart from some commentators who see this as referring to, and especially when they believe that the book of Daniel was written in this history, they think that that's what's being written about Antiochus Epiphanes, not about the papacy. So anyway, you have these wars, the 5 Syrian wars that are the important ones. And this fourth war is the one where we get the Battle of Raphia. And this is the one where we get the Battle of Penium. So if we're going to write these here, I'm just kind of jumping ahead. These are going to occur in these histories. Again. Okay. So now I'll click on it properly. There we go. So in the end of years, they shall join themselves together. So this passage states that in the end of years, Egypt and Syria would reconcile their differences and join themselves together. This became a necessity because of the fact that the two powers had engaged in both the First and Second Syrian wars. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, so he reigns from 282 to 245 BC. So you can see he's in this history here and this history here. So fairly, relatively long-lived king, had succeeded Ptolemy I to the throne of Egypt and felt increasingly insecure about the growing power of Seleucus I. Yet Seleucus I was unexpectedly assassinated in 280 BC by Ptolemy Keranos, the half-brother of Ptolemy II, and was succeeded by Antiochus I Soter. So we have in the north, we have the Seleucid Empire, but we have people named Antiochus, right? So they're not all named, thankfully. Seleucus I, second, third, and so forth. We have different names that are introduced. And they often will have, in the Ptolemaic Empire, they tend to be Ptolemy. And they'll have another appellation added at the end, like Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So they have these names that, if you know what they mean, they can help fit those characters into the story, keep them in your mind. Already in occupation in Kol Syria, Ptolemy II started the First Syrian War. So that's the one from 276 to 271 BC, with the first strike invasion against Antiochus I. Now you'll see here, if you look up here, this is what you can't see, but I wrote up here 274 to 271, which I got from Wikipedia. Here you'll see 276 to 271. So, they give slightly different dates. 2 years added to this one from the other one. But you're just going to find sometimes different ways in which people count that something occurred. So it's not always a straightforward saying, when did a war begin? Historians sometimes disagree over those types of things. Now, with a first strike invasion against Antiochus I. So Ptolemy does this first strike, and he does an invasion with the intent of preventing the new king from seeking revenge on the Egyptian family for his father's assassination. So they assassinate his father, Seleucus I, and then they figure they need to prevent any revenge by striking first. The two kings eventually concluded peace by 271 BC, which allowed Ptolemy to regain control of Kol Syria. Antiochus I was later killed in the war against Eumenes I of Pergamus in 261 BC, and was succeeded next by Antiochus II Theos. And so his reign is 261 to 246. So maybe, like other people, when they look at my chronology, their eyes start to glaze over. My eyes start to glaze over a little bit when I start looking at all of these different, these different kings and the different names, and I'm trying to fit them in chronologically. And I could write them all out, which I'm not going to do here for us now. Thankfully we have, some of them follow with the same person. Maybe that would always be the easiest if they would just say the first king, the second king. But of course we know that there was Seleucus, and then we have Antiochus. But these are names that are attached to the north at this time. So now we have this part which a lot of people remember, because the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make agreement. So some of us are familiar with this. Launching the Second Syrian War in 261 to 252 BC, Antiochus II sought to recover the territories lost during the First Syrian War and met with some success. Yet growing weary of continual conflict, the two kings would eventually join themselves together in peace. So again, they have these wars, but then they have these treaties. And that treaty is in 252 BC. And I've always wondered, the significance of that being 252. Number 2520 comes to mind. So I just thought it's an interesting date to note. And there might be some significance in that number there in regard to this history. In this treaty, the king's daughter of the south came to the king of the north to make an agreement. To secure peace, Ptolemy II would offer his daughter Berenice in marriage to Antiochus II, which would include a lucrative dowry. The Seleucid king agreed to these terms and exiled his current wife, Queen Laodice, and their two sons in the process. So, this becomes a little bit of like a drama, so to speak, of the things that happen. Probably be more suited to, some kind of soap opera on TV type of thing. But it is just a reality of what happened historically. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. Humiliated by her former husband, Laodice exacted revenge by assassinating Antiochus II through poisoning, 246 BC. Thus, the one who strengthened Berenice in those times did not stand. Having no protection, Berenice and her infant son were also eventually executed by Laodice, who would then have her own son proclaimed king, Seleucus II Callinicus. Therefore, having been given up and murdered with they that brought her attendants, Berenice would not retain the power of the arm, and her infant son, that's he that begat her, literally whom she brought forth, is so that he that begat her is kind of a mistranslation of the Hebrew. Literally, she brought forth, whom she brought forth, would also meet with the same fate, falling victim to the avenging wrath of the former queen, Laodice. So, that history is well known because of all the craziness of it. And I'm not sure how to apply this in a present truth application. So that's part of the issue. So like right now, we're just looking at the historical application. And so we know what happened. And we know that women, of course, can represent churches. We know there's also a mixture of church and state as a symbolism. So we have this woman involved, which would be a church, in setting up a king. And so in trying to apply this, I'm just going to go over to the notes that I had sent out before and look at how I had understood this. So I'm going to, before I move on to the other verses, I want to look at this and try to see if this makes sense. And this may not make sense. So we read some of this history already. And we're going to look at it. So it's Daniel 11, verse 5 to 6. And we're first going to address. And the king of the south, so that's Ptolemy the first. I put equals France in 538. So in 538, we have France, which is the king of the south. Now the king of the, and I put it there, and that may not be a correct way of understanding it. But we know France is the king of the south in 1790. And France is the power that puts the papacy on the throne. So, in trying to sort this through, that's how I looked at it. I would just put that parallel with Ptolemy. Shall be strong, and one of his, Alexander's princes, Seleucus I Nicator, which equals the papacy in this context. So that's the king of the north. And he, Seleucus, papacy, shall be strong above him, Ptolemy I, and have dominion, gain the territory of Syria. Now, of course, that's the original application. Historical application is gaining the territory of Syria. His dominion shall be a great dominion, so it becomes the largest territory of the Hellenistic empires. And in the end of years, after first and second Syrian wars, they, Ptolemy II Philadelphus and Antiochus I Soter, shall join themselves together, and they conclude peace in 252 BC. Now, the way that I looked at this is the Treaty of Tolentino. Now, we may not be familiar with the Treaty of Tolentino, so I'm just going to look this up. And, I'm not 100% certain about this. This application. The one is I did this a long time ago. This is big enough for people to read. Maybe I can zoom this in. Okay, the Treaty of Tolentino was a peace treaty between revolutionary France and the Papal States, signed on the 19th of February in 1797, and imposing terms of surrender on the Papal side. The signatories of France were the French Directory's ambassador, etc. So that's basically, there's a lot more to it, of course. But when we look at this parallel, if we wanted to call it a parallel here, where I've placed that France and the papacy are parallel to Ptolemy and Seleucus, or to the north and the south, because they're obviously not there in 252 BC. They conclude this peace treaty. So we have these powers that happened during the French Revolution, but of course it doesn't last, right? Because you have, what was the year for that again? Yeah, so 1797. So the 19th of February, 1797, you have this treaty between France and the Papal States, but basically a year later, the papacy, the Pope, is taken captive. So these types of treaties often are a pretext to some kind of war. They have this peace, which usually gives one of the powers time to then plan an attack. So they're not really honest peace treaties. Now, and the way that this, of course, happens for the king's daughter Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy II, of the South Egypt, shall come to the king of the north, Antiochus II Theos, which is the king of Syria, to make an agreement, peace through a marriage alliance. Now, so if we're going to try to parallel what's happening, France, which would parallel the South, Egypt, it's going to come to the king of the north, which is the papacy, to make an agreement, and they make this alliance. Now, I'm not sure of the whole history behind why France went into this agreement with the papacy, why they had this treaty. But we can see there that this there's these symbolisms here of these women. And I don't know how to apply these women as well, because we have two women here. We have Laodice and we have Berenice. And so we know that there's women represent churches. So if we try to apply these as churches, which churches would we assign to these? Obviously, we would say that Laodice here is attached to, because let me see here. So the south is Berenice. Laodice is attached to the north. So in order for them to push aside one church, if we were going to look at it this way, we're going to have this other church, which is the papacy. So the question is, who would Laodice represent? And then if Laodice is this this woman that's going to then kill the papacy, how would we apply that? And we could look at this church, Laodice, as addressing the spiritual nature, the goddess, maybe the goddess of reason, that is controlling France. So I know that's kind of, and I haven't really put that into the Present Truth notes, because I hadn't really thought about it back in 2017 when I wrote these notes. Any thoughts on that? Does that seem far-fetched? Or is there some other interpretation that we've had that you've noticed? Stephen, you got any thoughts on that? Have you studied this? Because we're going to have to come to some conclusion on this at some point. So Stephen, any thoughts on this? Dana, any thoughts? Anything you can bring to your memory regarding these? Are you guys still there?
Well, like Laodice just the meaning of it means people justice.
Yes, I was thinking of that myself. Yeah.
And the Berenice's victory, I think.
Yeah, and so, but you're thinking that that's a reasonable way to look at it. That there's these two churches, so to speak. The one is, of course, not a theistic church, because France does not have, they have this goddess of reason, but a goddess is still a symbol, a woman, a symbol of their new philosophy, their new way of doing things. And so this treaty that occurs, the Treaty of Tolentino, the way that I would look at it is that it's, let's say the jealousy of the people leads them to eventually go against the papacy and take the Pope captive. Right? So when it says, but she, Berenice, shall be given up, executed by Laodice, and they that brought her, execution of her attendants also, and he that begat her, she begat her son, he that strengthened her in these times. Right? So the power that's strengthening her is the power of Antiochus. That's the king of the north, but they turn upon them, and so they turn against the papacy. That's the way that I would look at it. But maybe there's more to it that I don't see, or maybe I'm making a misapplication. But you can see the difficulty here, and that's kind of what that I'm trying to point out. Because to me, there's a little bit of subjectivity in trying to make a present truth application. And I've seen lots of different applications as we've gone through this time of trying to understand Daniel chapter 11. And I don't remember Jeff actually really addressing this specifically, but maybe I missed it in watching his presentations on Daniel 11. But I don't really understand how to interpret these women other than as churches. So that would be my point in regard to that. So now we're going to go back to our notes. And we're going to start at verse 7. So that's our next section that we need to address. It says, but out of the branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods. So they're going to carry their gods captive into Egypt, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. So here we have, three verses which we're going to have to address. And so we'll first look at the historical application. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. So hearing that his sister was besieged by Laodice, Ptolemy III Euergetes, he reigned from 247 to 221 BC, the son of Ptolemy II, a branch of Berenice's roots, launched the Third Syrian War. It's also called the Laodicean War. I would assume over the fact that it has to do with Laodice. Marching against Syria while his sister was still alive. Having arrived too late to save the life of Berenice, Ptolemy III then desired to deal against them by coming with an army. He would ultimately prevail in this invasion into the fortress of the king of the north. Had led to the greatest military victory over Seleucid Syria ever achieved by the Ptolemaic dynasty. He conquered many Syrian cities and would have completed the total conquest of the Syrian Empire altogether had he not been forced to withdraw to Egypt, because of a homeland rebellion. Even so, Ptolemy III still returned to the land of the Nile as a conquering king, sporting the spoils of victory. So, and maybe when we start to look at this, I want to jump into the present truth application here. But we can see that definitely that this is referring to this battle where you talk about the fortress, into the fortress of the king of the north. And so we're going to look at that in a little more detail and trying to understand what this means. And shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods with their princes, and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. Despite having to return home in the face of an uprising, Ptolemy III would return to Egypt in triumph, carrying captives into Egypt, their gods, and the precious vessels of silver and gold, thus recovering pagan idols that had been taken from Egypt by the Persians in former conquests. In the face of Ptolemy's return to Egypt, a resurgent Seleucus II would regain much of his former territory and would even attempt an invasion of Coal Syria. This would result in a disastrous defeat for Seleucus II, and the two powers would eventually reach another peace agreement in 240 BC that would end the Third Syrian War. Overall, Ptolemy III would come into his kingdom, returning to his own land, and continue more years than the king of the north, living until 221 BC. The worn-down Seleucus would die an unexpected death after falling from his horse during a Parthian military campaign in 226 BC. So, in trying to understand this whole history, it's pretty clear that there's these battles going back and forth between the king of the north and the king of the south over Syria. And in trying to make this present truth application, when we start to look at that a little bit, I guess we should actually jump there because we're going to go to another section. Okay, so this is the section, verse 7 to 9. Out of the branch of her roots, Berenice's roots, or family, shall one, Ptolemy III, Euergetes. Now, we're going to put this here as Napoleon. So, and this would come from the French Revolution. We now have Napoleon who's paralleling Ptolemy III. Stand up in his estate, assume the throne of Egypt, which Napoleon, that's France, which shall come in with an army, launch an invasion, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north. Now, the Seleucid Syria, of course, is what's being talked in the historic, but we would parallel that, of course, with the papacy, and shall deal against them, attempt to exact revenge for his sister's death, and shall prevail, win the Third Syrian War, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, recover pagan idols captured from Egypt by the Persians in former conquests, and with their princes take captives to Egypt with their precious vessels of silver and gold, spoils of war. Now, in trying to apply this here, there's lots I haven't addressed. But we do know that Napoleon, he waged wars where he actually conquered Egypt. So Napoleon had expanded his empire. So when he says recover pagan idols captured from Egypt, in this case, it's Egypt that is now being, in the present truth application, Egypt is now having these items being stolen from them and being brought to France. So it's almost like a reverse of what happened in the historical application. But France now, of course, is the king of the south. Now, we're going to run into this later in the book of Daniel. So when we look at Uriah Smith understands to a large degree Daniel chapter 11, and especially the role of France. But what he does as he moves later into Daniel 11 is he has France become this other power between the king of the north and the king of the south. So France becomes this third power when we get to Daniel 11, verse 40. He puts three powers there, where we see that there are two powers, and France is one of those powers. And France does not become a separate power. It becomes either the king of the north or the king of the south, historically. So in this case, we're putting that France is the king of the south, not Egypt, and that the king of the north is the papacy, not Islam, not the Ottoman Empire. So there are some differences between how Uriah Smith concludes it, but he seems to me he's inconsistent with what he first lays down and how he tries to decide the role of these different powers. Now, of course, we're doing a present truth application here, but we can see that there's this consistency if we keep France as the king of the south, and we keep the king of the north as the papacy. So he recognizes the king of the north as the papacy, but he's not consistent because he tries to hold to the territory that they control, which doesn't seem consistent to me, to have the king of the north being the papacy at one time, and then and the king of the south to be Egypt, and to introduce France now as a new power, when it's pretty clear that France is the king of the south. But there's these differences. So, and we also know that there are other people with different interpretations. Some people would put the king of the north or the king of the south as Turkey, instead of Turkey being the king of the north. So if you're going to have the papacy being the king of the north at one time, you can't put Turkey as the king of the north at another time. And the France obviously is the king of the south, not some other power. So, I know I'm not explaining that well because that's something way, way later on. But this is part of the problem that we have here, is we have to sort out this role of Napoleon as we look at the present truth application. And we're going to start, as we move on in this study, we're going to start looking at the pivotal verse, which is Daniel 11:11, and trying to understand what happens there. So I'm just going to read this back again. So the third Syrian war, they win the third Syrian war. That is, I'll just read this over again. But out of the branch of her roots shall one, Ptolemy III, stand up in his estate, assume the throne of Egypt, which is France, which shall come with an army, launch an invasion, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the south, or the king of the north, pardon me, that's the papacy, and shall deal against them, attempt to exact revenge for his sister's death. So this is this new French Republic taking revenge for this treaty that has happened, and shall prevail, win the third Syrian war, and shall carry captives into Egypt, their gods, recover pagan idols captured from Egypt by the Persians in former conquests, with their princes, take captives to Egypt, and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, spoils of war, Ptolemy III shall continue more years. He died in 221 BC. Than the king of the north. Seleucus II died in 226. So in trying to make this application, the king of the north is the papacy. Now the papacy, of course, receives this deadly wound. And we know that the king of the south survives that history. It continues longer. But we know that ultimately the king of the north is going to again come against the king of the south. So the king of the south, Ptolemy, shall come to his Seleucus kingdom, Syria, and shall return to his own land. It's Egypt. So this is France. Now what happens to France then? And this is where I'm weak on French history. I know Napoleon rises. He becomes a dictator. He conquers a large territory. He eventually dies. And France sort of reverts back to Catholicism. So the king of the north ends up being, even though it, the Pope's taken captive, the papacy, in a sense, wins that battle. I mean, they don't win the battle, but they continue on. France goes back to being somewhat, not really a Christian nation, but somewhat of a Christian nation. They become Catholic again. So that whole French Revolution fails. And so trying to relate that to this history, I think there are some details that we would still have to work out, which I haven't. So, and you can see as we look ahead in these notes, I didn't put in any present truth applications, but we can do that as we start to go through these different passages. So I'm going to see how much time we have here. So we're going to take a break, a 3-minute break, and collect our thoughts. So I'm just going to pause this recording for a moment. Okay, well, let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we just ask for your Spirit to be here as we try to sort through some of the mistakes I made as we're going through this history in the book of Daniel. Help me to understand it. Help us all to understand these things. We pray in Jesus' name. Okay, so Stephen, you're going to help me go through this. Now, okay, so we're backing up because I made some mistakes. I got Berenice and Laodice mixed up. So we have this Treaty of Tolentino. And the Treaty of Tolentino, we're paralleling it with this peace treaty that concluded in 252 BC. It concluded the Syrian War, which would be the Second Syrian War. And so the Treaty of Tolentino, as we saw, is this peace treaty between France, and it's in February 19th, 1797. So it's about a year before the Pope is taken captive. And in trying to understand this treaty, the way that I looked at it is I looked at these, the Berenice represents a church, and that would be the Church of France, which I had it backwards for some reason. And then Laodice would represent the papacy, the religious part of the papacy. Now, one of the things that we've noticed is that France is the one that put the papacy upon the throne of the world. And France is the one that takes the papacy off the throne in 1798. So you have France, which we're marking as the king of the south, and we're having the papacy, which we're marking as the king of the north. But in this original application of the king of the north and the king of the south, we have this treaty. And this treaty comes where the king's daughter, Berenice, so that's the king of the south, his daughter, goes to the king of the north, that's Antiochus II, to make an agreement. So this is a marriage alliance. But she, Berenice, who is going from the south to the north, she does not retain the power of the arm. She's going to lose her position from the former Queen Laodice. So I think I got them mixed up. But my point is that if we're going to look at this parallel that happened in 1797, we see that there's this agreement made, but then this agreement doesn't turn out well for the papacy. So the papacy is the king of the north. And so the south has tried to make an agreement with the north. Now, we made some reference to Laodice represents the people. So Laodice is in the north. So I just got the names mixed up, I think, when I was going through it before. So does this make sense to you, Stephen, what I'm talking about here?
Yes.
Okay. So Now, when it says Antiochus II is assassinated by Laodice, we say that Laodice is in the north. How would we then make that application that France is assassinated by the papacy? So I flipped it the other way around, right? Obviously, it's the France that assassinates or brings the deadly wound upon the papacy. You see the problem that I'm having if I'm making that application.
There is a general or
Okay.
someone of authority in who is in Rome,
Yep.
and when he's assassinated, that gives Napoleon the
Okay.
opportunity to then go into Rome to remove the papacy.
Okay. So
That,
Rome,
that
so,
death,
so Rome kind of reneges on the treaty then?
yes.
Okay. See, and that's the bit of information that I'm missing. And that's why I got it mixed around, because when I saw this assassinated, I was applying it to the Pope. But I actually think it's going to occur as we go on in Daniel 11. So yeah, and that's where I always have problems. All these names and who's who, I always get them mixed up. So so when it says Berenice shall be given up, executed by Laodice, that means the papacy, even though they make this alliance, they're the ones that aren't really serious about the alliance.
Well, they're sort of they're blamed for a death of a general.
Yeah.
This year general, he tries to do something which the papacy is not in agreement with, and there's some rebellion in Rome, and or like a riot or something, and this general gets killed, and so Napoleon then uses that as an excuse then to come in and to remove the Pope from Rome.
Okay. Yeah, see, this is, I've been reading all this old history. I haven't been reading, the French stuff. I've been reading all about the historical application. I should be reading about Napoleon if I really want to understand the present truth application here. Okay, so thanks for that. Now let's just keep going on here. So we know out of the branch of her, Berenice's roots, shall one Ptolemy III Euergetes. So I'm putting that as Napoleon. I'm equating Ptolemy III with Napoleon in the present truth application. Shall stand up in his estate, assume the throne of Egypt, France, which shall come with an army, launch an invasion, and shall attempt to enter into the fortress of the king of the north. So this is where I knew once I got here that I'd made a wrong application earlier, because this is really about when Napoleon's general, Berthier, goes into the fortress of the king of the north and takes the papacy captive, right? Stephen, you would agree with me on that?
Yes.
Okay. Where when I was looking at the earlier one, this is actually talking about a battle that becomes the excuse for this army invasion. So that makes much more sense. So I knew once I got here that I was treading on some pretty soft ground. Okay, so now this makes much more sense to me, and that's the part of the history that I missed. And so they enter into the fortress of the king of the north and shall deal against them. Now, of course, this is, in the historical application, this is the south attacking the north. And this is going to be the third Syrian war, right? They shall deal against them, attempt to exact revenge for his sister's death, and shall prevail, win the third Syrian war, and shall also carry captives into Egypt. Now, in this case, then, so we're looking at the historical application first. The South wins this war and takes back a lot of its possessions. Now, in this case, the South is France, if we put it into the present truth application, where we're repeating this history. and it's repeating in the time of the French Revolution. How would you interpret these recovered pagan idols from Egypt? Would you take that as some way in which France, because what happens to France? I mean, France eventually becomes Catholic. It doesn't, it abandons, the French Revolution really fails as far as establishing this atheistic power and state. It reverts back to Catholicism in order to survive. So how would you interpret this? Or are we just something we're not understanding, or I'm not understanding anyway?
When Berthier goes into Rome,
Yeah.
There's a lot of artwork that France takes from Rome and takes it back to France again. Or maybe, I don't know whether they had originally been in France or not, but they just go out and raid a lot of the artwork from Rome and take them to France.
But it is interesting also that France, at this time, they conquer Egypt as well. And they go into Egypt and actually steal a lot of stuff from Egypt, where in the historical application, Egypt is regaining things that were stolen from them. But you're just saying it would refer to the artwork that France takes back from the papacy.
Well, that's what the application, I've understood, that's what I've heard. I didn't come up with it, that's what was originally taught.
Yeah, okay. So I can see there's a lot of studying I'm still going to have to do to get this all sorted out. It's not easy. This is not an easy study to go through this. I mean, we can easily go through the historical application. Those seem pretty clear. But when we start to get into the present truth application, I could see that there's different ways in which we could interpret this. Now, I think it's correct, definitely, to place this with France, right? So this, and the question is, why would we do that? If we're going to talk about a present truth application, the question is, why are we going back to France in this history? Why are we not in the present? If you know what I'm saying. Like, why are we not in 1798 applying this? I mean, because we are, in a sense, applying it to some degree, but in the application that has been done in the past, we applied this to Napoleon, the Treaty of Tolentino, the papacy in France, which we see in Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. But why are we still there? Why are we not in the present truth application? Why are we not moving into our history in this time? Because we also have a parallel between Napoleon and what's happening at the present, right? We can equate Trump with Napoleon. So the question is, why are we going back here in our present truth application to look at Napoleon and not to look at Trump? That's a question I have that I don't have the answer to.
In verse 6 it says, and in the end of years.
Yeah.
I think there's an application there that's maybe like the time of the end.
Okay. But the time of the end is also 1798.
Yes.
Right. So that's my point, is that we've made this application, and this is 2017 when I wrote these notes, right? So that was what was being discussed in 2017. And this would have been like September, October, maybe. No, this actually would have been August of 2017, I think, when I wrote these notes. So before, a lot of other stuff happened in 2017 in September. We had the organizational meeting in Romania. Lots of changes happened. And in some ways, even though people kept on for a time trying to understand Daniel 11, I really think that by September of 2017, our applications of Daniel 11, any advancing light that we might have had, was basically we were put into darkness because of what happened within the movement. There was no more advancement, and we sort of fractured into a bunch of different views on Daniel chapter 11. So we know that Jeff has tried to recover those truths of Daniel 11, he hasn't dealt with, at least in my view of the things that I've watched, he really hasn't dealt with some of these details or some of these problems. At least he hasn't addressed them openly. Because that's where I would have a problem here. In trying to apply this to Napoleon and France, I think that we can make that application. But I think we also need to see how it connects with our history. But that's just my thoughts on it. It's not like I'm adamant about it or anything. Okay, so let's move to this next part because I think it's important. We're going to go back to our notes. And I think we're not going to get much past verse 11. And in the next study, I'm going to have to go back over some of this with more thoughts about it and a bit more. I see some of the weaknesses I have in my background on this. I said earlier to my wife, this is kind of like, reminds me of when I had to do a book report in grade 8 and I hadn't read the book. It was, not great. That's kind of how I feel in doing this presentation today. It's like, I don't know enough, about this information to sort it through in any sort of way, more than to ask questions. At least I think I know enough how to ask questions and see where the weakness is in what we understand. So we're going to go on and look at Daniel 10 to 13 and see how we can address these, because these I'm a little bit more familiar with. But his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s. But he shall not be strengthened. And I have to do this here. I can't see that. By it. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and much riches. So here we're on an area, at least that I know I'm familiar with. And I can see where we would make this application when we deal with coming into the fortress and unto the fortress. But his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a great multitude, or multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. Because of the unprecedented victory of Ptolemy III in the Third Syrian War, the two sons of Seleucus II were stirred up to avenge the humiliation of their father. The weak and short-tempered Seleucus III, Cyranus Soter, ascended to the throne, but ruled only for a short time after being poisoned by his military officers. He was succeeded by his 18-year-old brother Antiochus III Magnus, and he reigned from 223 to 187 BC, who assembled a multitude of great forces to launch the Fourth Syrian War. He would overflow, meeting with initial success, recapturing much of the territory lost during the Third Syrian War, which would also include the prize of Kol Syria. These victories by Antiochus III were so decisive that the Egyptian naval presence in the Mediterranean had been neutralized and its army demoralized, thus leaving Egypt open to invasion. Yet despite the vulnerability of his rival, Antiochus III delayed to capitalize on this opportunity. This costly hesitation on his part, coupled with the distraction of an internal rebellion in the east by a disloyal satrap in Babylon, would delay Antiochus's attention on Egypt long enough to give the successor of Ptolemy III, Ptolemy IV, Philopator, the necessary time needed to regroup and assemble a powerful army. Later, by the time Antiochus III had returned from his eastern distraction in Babylon to resume his warfare against Egypt, Ptolemy IV had rebuilt a large enough military force to contend with his Seleucid rival and attempt to recapture Kol Syria. So, of course, we know that this is going to deal with the Fourth Syrian War. And so he would overflow and he would and come, and he shall return and be stirred up even to his fortress. So this idea where we have, and this is one of the reasons why I think that we have had this application where we look at Napoleon coming into the fortress of the papacy. But when the papacy comes against, and this is where we would now apply this to 1989. At least that's the way that I would look at this. We would have that they're going to come up to his fortress, even to his fortress, if we're going to continue on that line. So that's one way that I've seen it. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on this, coming even to his fortress? Would you apply that to 1989, or would you apply this somewhere else?
Yeah, 1989.
Okay. Right. And because we know that we believe that the Soviet Union fell in 1989, and it did fall, but Russia didn't fall, and Russia was the head. And so we've done lots of studies on this. One of the places we go is Isaiah chapter 7 and chapter 8. So let's go there, because some people may not have this background of what we're talking about. So the idea of this overflowing, it comes from, well, let's look at Isaiah 8 first. This is talking about Assyria. And there's other places also in the book of Isaiah where they talk about this overflowing scourge. And it's Isaiah 8:8, and he shall pass through Judah, he shall overflow and go over, he shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. So this idea of going even to the neck, if we go back to chapter 7, and we look at this, the beginning, this civil war that's occurring between the king of the north and the king of the south, the king of the north here being Syria and Ephraim, and the king of the south being Judah. It talks about the head of, in verse 8, the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And so the head, that word, Hebrew word head, is just Rosh, and it's referring to the capital city, is called the head city. So the head of Syria, or the capital of Syria, is Damascus. And the king, the head of the city of Damascus, is Rezin. He's the king of Syria, but he rules in Damascus. And Damascus would be his fortress. And we saw in chapter 8:8 that Assyria, when they come as they overflow and go over, but they reach to the neck. And so the idea is that in 1989, when the papacy came against, along with the United States, came against the king of the south, which this time is Russia, because Russia has inherited that French Revolution, which basically died off in France. France did not become, an atheistic country. They were for a time. They became Catholic. The Soviet Union is an atheistic power, and it has inherited that revolution from France. So in 1989, we know that Louis F. Weir in 1957 wrote a book that addresses this, that based on Daniel 11 verse 40b, that the United States and the papacy would come against the Soviet Union and conquer it. And so we saw that in 1989, the Soviet Union fell. But it only came up to the fortress. It didn't conquer it completely. And so when we look at this history that we're studying here in the historic application, right? His son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. So this would parallel what happened in 1989. And one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. So he doesn't come into the fortress. So it says, because of the unprecedented victory of Ptolemy III in the Third Syrian War, the two sons of Seleucus were stirred up to avenge the humiliation of their father, the weak, short-tempered Seleucus III, Cyrenius Soter, ascended to the throne, but ruled only for a short time after being poisoned by his military officers. He was succeeded by his 18-year-old brother Antiochus III Magnus, who assembled a multitude of great forces to launch the Fourth Syrian War. He would overflow, meeting with initial success, recapturing much of the territory lost during the Third Syrian War, which would include the prize of Kol Syria. These victories of Antiochus were so decisive that the Egyptian naval presence in the Mediterranean had been neutralized. So you can see this is this whole thing that happens, which we already read. But we see that they don't completely conquer the king of the north, right? So they don't completely conquer the Soviet Union. The king of the south shall be moved with choler and shall come forth to fight with him. Even with the king of the north, he shall set a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into his hand, and when he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up and cast down by many 10,000s, but he shall be strengthened by it. Now, I'm just going to jump to our notes here. So the king of the south, Ptolemy IV, shall be moved with choler, raising a large army, and shall come forth and fight with him, continue the Fourth Syrian War, even with the king of the north, Antiochus III. And he and Antiochus shall set forth a great multitude, a large army, but the multitude, Antiochus's army, shall be given into his, Ptolemy's hand, and Ptolemy IV would defeat Antiochus III at the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC. And when he, Ptolemy, had taken away the multitude, the Syrian army, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s. But he, Ptolemy IV, shall not be strengthened by not complete the conquest for Syria. For the king of the north, Antiochus III, shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, start the Fifth Syrian War. Shall certainly come after years. He regrouped from 212 to 204 BC, and with a great army and with much riches, Antiochus III would defeat Ptolemy V, Epiphanes, at the Battle of Panium in 201-200 BC, driving Egypt out of Judea-Palestine once and for all. So this is the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Panium. And this is what we have studied and come to understand, is that when we look at what happened in 1989, there follows these two battles. So we saw that they came up to his fortress, right? We saw that Ptolemy IV Philopaters, so that's the king of the south. The United States and the papacy came up to the fortress, but they did not conquer the Soviet Union. Well, they did conquer the Soviet Union, but not Russia. And Russia is the head. So the idea is they just came up to the neck. And so we're going to be looking into this, obviously, in a lot more detail than we are at the present time. But I want to try to illustrate what we're talking about here. So in trying to place this history in, if we're going to put it into a present truth application, we are seeing that this period, these wars, the way that we've lined these up is we have said that this is 1798, around that time. You know, obviously it starts before then, but it's at the time of the end. This is where we have this history that's going to unfold. So this is the rise of the United States. Maybe I should put it like 1776 to 1798, maybe something like that. But this is dealing mostly with France. Not the United States is not really being addressed in this history here. France and the papacy are the powers that are being addressed here. So we're going to know that in this one, you're going to have, this is the king of the north, this is the king of the south. Over here, the king of the north is going to be the papacy, is the north, and France is the south. And so we looked at this history of the first and second Syrian wars, and we saw that Treaty of Tolentino, which is in 1797. So we'll maybe make it this way. I'm just choosing arbitrarily 1776. We're not really starting with that history. But we're dealing with this time of this revolution in the United States and this revolution in France. And then we're going to have that Treaty of Tolentino on February 19th, 1797. But then we're going to have the time of the end, 1798. And if we're going to parallel these, we know that these battles continue, the first and second, but now we get to the Third Syrian War, and the Third Syrian War is going to be 1989. We want to look at it this way. So the Third Syrian War is the king of the north coming up to the fortress, but it doesn't conquer them. So you have the USSR. But then we had always just understood that this was this history. This tied 1798 to 1989 through Daniel 11, verse 40, A and B. But as we started to look back into this repeat of history, we came to recognize that this battle again was going to occur in this history. There's going to be a battle of Raphi and the battle of Panium. And so we came to recognize that in our line, we're also going to have a Raphia and a Panium. And so this is the north versus the south. In this one, the south, or in this one, in the Battle of Raphia, the south is going to win. So it's responding again. Just like 1798 and 1989 are these battles. In this case, the king of the south wins. In this case, the king of the north wins. Now we're going to have the south win and then the north win again. And this would line up with, I think I did this wrong. I think this is the Third Syrian War here. Yes. How do I do this, Raphi and Panium? Yeah, I wouldn't put Panium as, this is Panium. No, that's right. I did this right. Raphia and Panium. Yeah, because this happens in this history. So Raphi and Panium, that's the Fourth and Fifth Syrian War. And then this is the end of, basically that's the end of the king of the south. So the north wins, the king of the south ends. And so the Seleucid Empire becomes the dominating power. So that's where my understanding sort of begins and ends to some degree in understanding this. I know this history, but there's so many details that I don't know. And as we start to look at this a little bit more, we're going to go and read through. Go back here. So I'm going to continue reading here. I'm going to share the screen and we'll finish this off. So we don't have a lot of time. Yeah. The king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. And he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. Having secured enough time to assemble and train a large invasion force, described in this passage as a great multitude, Ptolemy IV would be moved with choler to continue the Fourth Syrian War against the king of the north, He would march his army into Palestine once again, taking up his position south of Gaza near Raphia in 217 BC. And on June 22nd, the two armies met in battle. Antiochus III would initially taste success, but after the cavalry on both sides had neutralized each other, the infantry would be left to decide the outcome. As it turned out, the superior wisdom of his Greek commanders and the well-disciplined condition of his army would allow Ptolemy IV to triumph. In the end, the multitude of the Seleucid army was given into his hand. His victory at Raphia would present a similar opportunity to that of Antiochus III 2 years earlier, as Syria would then lay open to invasion. Yet consistent with the cautious attitude characteristic of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy IV would be content with only regaining Coal Syria and did not complete the conquest of Syria in its entirety. Thus, while having taken away the multitude, Ptolemy IV would not be strengthened by his victory and would return to his homeland fully content with the status quo. So the way that we've come to understand that in our history is that we would have this Battle of Raphia, and the Battle of Raphia would be where the Russians have a victory, but they're not strengthened by this victory. They're actually, in some ways, maybe weakened by it. Now, we had initially looked for that on November 9th. I have a note there, which I'm going to have to address a bit later. While having taken away the multitude, Ptolemy would not be strengthened by it. So we know that Russia is not going to be strengthened by this battle against the United States. And the question is, what is this battle? And how would we recognize it? And back in 2017, on February 14th, there was a lot of discussion. Was it going to be some kind of a hot war? Was it going to be some kind of Cold War? Later on, we came to understand that this was supposed to be an information war, and how that's applied and how it's understood, I don't think it's really very clear what conclusion we came to regarding that. So how we would apply this in this history is, to me, not very clear. And it says, "For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and much riches." So once again, the king of the north would return with a multitude greater than the former, coming after certain years with a great army and much riches. In other words, Antiochus III would regroup militarily from the years 212 to 2004 BC and attempt to renew his warfare with Egypt. He would also seek to capitalize on the death of Ptolemy IV, who would be succeeded by a 5-year-old boy named Ptolemy V Epiphanes. Antiochus III felt that the youth of Ptolemy IV presented an ample opportunity to seek revenge for his defeat at Raphia by starting the Fifth Syrian War through an invasion of southern Syria, the seizure of Gaza, and the occupation of Palestine. Antiochus III desired to press south to pulverize the young Egyptian monarch with an outright invasion of Egypt itself. The young boy king would respond by dispatching his army under the leadership of an Aetolian commander named Scopas, who would initially meet with success in recapturing southern Syria, Gaza, and Palestine, driving the forces of Antiochus III back into the region of Lebanon. And yet, even in the face of Scopas' initial success during the re-invasion of Coal Syria, Antiochus III would not be deterred and launched another attack on the region. He would eventually meet Scopas in battle near the mouth of a Jordan River in a place called Panium, later named Caesarea Philippi. This battle would serve as the major turning point in the history of the Syrian wars, because Antiochus III would rout Scopas and the Egyptian army so decisively that Ptolemaic control of Coal Syria would end once and for all. With the eventual besiegement of the remaining Egyptian forces at Sidon, Scopas had no choice but to surrender unconditionally. Thus, the Battle of Panium eventually concluded the Fifth Syrian War and Egypt would never have control over Kol Syria again. So, and that's the end of this section I think that we can address here today. So we have the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Peniam, and we have placed them in different ways in our history. Initially, we were looking at Raphia as being a battle between the North and the South, and that we had marked as November 9th, 2019. Now, that battle did not occur, unless somebody wants to argue that it was just some kind of information battle. But I don't see how we could say that Russia prevailed in that sense, or that anybody really prevailed over this information warfare, which still is continuing. So, I'm not really sure, how to address that. I don't know if I fully understand where we're going to place Raphia now. Some people are placing Raphia on July 18th, 2020. I would say that Raphia is a period of time, as is Peniam. I wouldn't look at a single date. And my view was to look at Raphia as starting on November 9th and being completed on July 18th, 2020. That's my initial ideas regarding it. But yeah, we're going to have to sort of wait and see, I think, to some degree to understand this fully. But this is where we're at. We're at trying to understand the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Peniam, and where this is going to lead in our understanding as we move forward. I'm not certain, because I know that this has not been sorted through completely. There are some things that we know, and some things that we don't know. And a lot of the things that what we don't know is we don't know what we don't know. There's things that we don't know yet that we are not aware of. So to me, it's just, I sort of feel like I'm in a wait and see position to some degree to understand how we're going to make the present truth application of these in a complete way. Now, there are some significant points that we need to recognize. So I'm just going to kind of review a little bit. So one thing that we can see when we study Daniel chapter 11, and I erased the map, but we know that the Kol Syria, or Palestine, or Judea, is in the middle of this battle between the North and the South. And at different times in history, that can be really literally the king of the North and the king of the South. But it also can be, France and the papacy. It can also be the United States and Russia. So we have different groups that can be recognized in that prophecy. We also have a precedence that go way back even within Israel between the North and the South, and also in the United States of the Civil War between the North and the South. All these battles between the North and the South all have significance typologically to what's happening in the present day. Now, we also have to recognize, of course, Syria does exist, and evangelicals and dispensationalists would just put their emphasis upon it in repeating history, that Syria is just Syria, where we would say that obviously Syria is not Syria. Syria represents the king of the south, or this territory. Syria is in alliance now with Russia. And I've done some other studies which are not major studies here, dealing with the king of Syria. Can't think of his name.
Assad?
Yeah, Assad. Yeah. And there's significances when you look at his history. That on July 18th, for instance, he would have his, every 7 years he's appointed again as the king of Syria. And the first time I think it was on July 16th. The second time it was on July 18th that he made his acceptance speeches. And these become really significant. And then the third time, so it was in the year, I'm trying to remember even what years it was. I can't remember. So, I need to go over
2000,
2007 and 2014.
The year 2000.
Yeah, and then 2007 and 2014,
Okay.
right? And he would be due again, in 2021. So that he would again retain his kingship. But he's in an alliance with Russia. So there are ways in which people will try to look at what Syria is, and they just apply them literally. But we also know that if we're going to make a present truth application, we're not applying things literally, we're applying them symbolically. So we would have to look at Syria in the context of these, being the king of the north is representing the papacy, and the United States in its alliance with the papacy. And then we would look at Ptolemaic Empire as a parallel to the Soviet Union, just as it would be a parallel to France. So there is, definitely, there's ways in which we could look at this on different layers, and we have to sort out what's correct. Excuse me there. So we have these battles. God's people are caught in the middle, and this land, Syria, Kol Syria, is, it's Judea. It's the land of Israel that's caught in the middle of this battle. Now, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is caught in the middle of this battle. So if you're going to try to apply Syria, and you're going to say it's Syria, or you're going to say it's the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you have two completely different interpretations. But we know when we get later on into Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, that we have God's holy mountain. We have God's people being represented in that history. And it's not literal land of Israel that's being represented. So I think that there's a lot of confusion that's been introduced in how we understand these things when we look at a historical application and then we try to apply it in our time. I think we've mixed things together. We've mixed literal and spiritual in ways that we shouldn't have. So that's as far as I think I can get today. I'm going to try to get more prepared for next week because I really want to study the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Panium. I'm going to have to, think about it, pray about it, but also need to go over some old videos because I want to bring us through how we're applying this now and where we're going to place these on our line. And I know we can say, Trump had a Battle of Raphia and a Battle of Panium. So Trump, lost the Battle of Raphia when he was impeached, and then when he was exonerated on February 5th, 2020, then that's the Battle of Panium for him. And I don't have problems with that idea, but that's not the main Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Panium that we understood in regard to this message. And so that's what I really want to understand is, can we place these at a specific time or not? So I know we didn't have a lot of people here at the start of this. We got quite a few more people now. So a lot of you missed all my fumbling through this study. But we're going to have to go over this again. And because I see a lot of the weaknesses that I have in my own understanding. So I recommend that people here who are on there now, that you spend some time and go over this video. It wasn't very good, at least not in coming to any solid conclusions. It might be good at realizing how little we know or how little we understand regarding Daniel 11 and its present truth application. And so I hope that many of you can join us next week and that we can go over some of this again and fill in some of these details that we're missing. And there's some very, very helpful things have been mentioned. For instance, there are some notes here. Angela made a note. I think we have suspected Russia as taking down the West, especially targeting the US dollar in a hot war, but it has been far more successful over decades in undermining Protestantism and capitalism ideologically. The New Omega movement has imbibed the so-called communism, as they will be thoroughly routed when we are raised up as an enzyme starting this July. she figures. So one of the things I have a thought dealing with the way that Russia operates. Russia has operated in an information war with the conspiracy theories. Russia creates conspiracy theories to create division. It operates much the same way that the Jesuits do, is to cause a civil war in the United States, to weaken the United States that way by pitting Republicans against Democrats. And in my research, I found that Russia equally did advertising to support the Democrats as it did to support the Republicans. That Russia was really just trying to cause division. They weren't concerned who won. All they were concerned is that America is divided. So, you know, there's some things here about Russia in trying to understand its role. And then Stephen also put a comment regarding Pius VI, sued for peace, which was granted at Tolentino on the 19th of February, 1797, but not on the 27th of December, 1797, but on the 28th of December, 1797, in a riot blamed by papal forces on some Italian and French revolutionists. The popular Brigadier General Mathurin Leonard Dufault, who had gone to Rome with Joseph Bonaparte as part of the French embassy, was killed, and a new pretext was furbished for invasion. So this is referring to some earlier material that we went through in trying to apply this to France. So we're gonna try to regroup this week. Hopefully some of you can help. I know that I'm going to go over my notes. Now I sort of have an understanding of where we can flesh this out. And I'm going to try to prepare some notes maybe that I can give to people beforehand, try to update the present truth application that we have so we can kind of see where we're going. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for the time that we've had to study. And thank you for showing us how little we know. Help us to understand your word. We go to you for strength and guidance and understanding. Be with each person. Help us in our personal study. We ask and pray this in Jesus' name.